My name is Dr. Elias Mercer, and I am a wildlife biologist specializing in large carnivores, particularly wolves. For nearly a decade, my work has carried me deep into forests, across tundras and over mountains, where the howl of a wolf is both data point and haunting soundtrack. I began as a graduate student with a fascination for predator-prey dynamics, but over the years, the science hardened into routine: GPS collars, scat analysis, den monitoring, the patient recording of patterns that most people would dismiss as insignificant. I am by nature and training a rational man. Numbers and evidence anchor me. I do not lend myself easily to superstition. And yet, when I think back on what happened during that winter expedition in Montana, I wonder if my faith in science was not only challenged, but dismantled, piece by piece, under the weight of something I still cannot define. The expedition began with promise. Our small team, myself, a doctoral candidate named Claire Whitmore, and a field technician, Jonah Pike, set out in late January. Our base of operations was a research cabin tucked against the foothills of the Madison Range, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The cabin itself was a relic of an earlier study, its wooden frame weathered by decades of snow, wind, and isolation. To reach it required a snowmobile journey through winding trails where spruce trees pressed close and the silence of winter seemed absolute. We had come to track a pack known locally as the Iron Ridge Wolves. 12 individuals had been identified in the group last autumn, their territory spanning over 200 square miles. Ranchers in the valleys below were anxious, as livestock depredation had risen, though not dramatically. Still, tensions always flare when wolves are involved. The state had approved limited collaring for research, and our team had permits to tranquilize and tag up to 3 individuals. It was a straightforward mission: locate the pack, fit collars, record behavior, and build data that might ease the inevitable conflict between conservationists and cattlemen. The first days followed the familiar rhythm of fieldwork. Claire, meticulous and sharp-eyed, handled much of the telemetry, while Jonah's strength and easy humor kept the mood light during long treks on snowshoes. I split my time between coordination, note-taking, and the quiet thrill of following wolf tracks across blank stretches of snow. The animals were near, their paw prints, so precise, so deliberate, crisscrossed ridges and valleys, leading us deeper into their domain. Nights fell cold and swift, and in the cabin's narrow rooms, the 3 of us hunched over maps, planning routes while the wind battered the shutters. On the 4th night, the howling began. At first, it was distant, a rising chorus rolling down from the ridges like a tide of sound. The Iron Ridge Wolves were announcing themselves, a communal call that vibrated through the air and the floorboards alike. We paused our conversation mid-sentence, listening. For me, it was a familiar song, one I had heard countless times, yet it never lost its power. Claire smiled, her face lit with awe. Jonah muttered something reverent, half joking but half serious, about ancient spirits in the hills. We let the howls wash over us until they faded into silence. The next morning, we set out early, following telemetry signals that suggested several collared wolves from a neighboring pack had crossed into Iron Ridge territory. Competition between packs can be brutal, and this overlap was worth noting. The signals drew us higher into the range, where the trees thinned and the snow lay deep, untouched. We moved carefully, scanning for movement, ears tuned to every shift in the wind. Around midday, Jonah pointed out something unusual. Ahead, on the edge of a frozen clearing, lay a carcass. From a distance, I assumed it was an elk brought down by the wolves, but as we approached, my certainty dissolved. The animal, if it could be called that, was scarcely recognizable. It had the size of an elk, yes, but its features were distorted, wrong. The antlers twisted at unnatural angles, as though they had grown in spirals rather than branches. The body was stretched oddly, with limbs too long, the ribcage collapsed inward, and the hide torn in a pattern that did not match wolf predation. Wolves are efficient killers. They take down prey by hamstringing and suffocating, tearing flesh in precise, practiced ways. This carcass looked mangled, shredded, as if torn apart by something that didn't know or care how animals are supposed to come apart. "What the hell?" Jonah whispered, crouching near the remains but not daring to touch. Claire raised her camera, snapping photos with rapid clicks. I circled the carcass slowly, my mind turning over possibilities. Disease, mutation, some kind of accident. Yet no framework of biology could hold what I was seeing. The air around it felt heavier, charged, as though the clearing itself rejected explanation. We marked the location on our GPS, logged the details, and retreated, unsettled. The wolves had not returned to feed. That alone was unusual. Wolves strip a carcass down to bone in winter. To abandon such a bounty suggested avoidance, perhaps fear. That night, the howling came again. But it was different. The voices rose frantic, broken, more a scream than a song. I woke from shallow sleep to the sound, my chest tight with unease. Through the frost-crusted window, I thought I saw movement on the ridge. Dark figures against the snow watching. By the time I blinked, they were gone. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere shifted. Tracks we followed ended abruptly, as if the animals had vanished mid-stride. One morning, we found a circle in the snow where several wolves had milled nervously, their paw prints churning the surface into chaos, but no trail led away. It was as though they had been swallowed by the air itself. On the 6th day, everything escalated. We had followed a strong signal from one of the neighboring collared wolves into a narrow ravine. The cliffs pressed close, snow piled deep, and the silence there was suffocating. As we descended, the signal grew erratic, leaping in strength, then vanishing, then returning again. Claire frowned at the receiver, tapping it as though to correct a malfunction. That was when Jonah froze, raising his hand. A head half, buried in snow, was another carcass. But this time it was no elk. It was a wolf. The body was stretched the same way, limbs elongated beyond their natural proportions. The head was twisted backward, the jaw unhinged, eyes wide with a frozen terror that chilled me more than the wind ever could. Its pelt had been flayed in spirals, as though something had worked at it with deliberate cruelty. I felt my stomach lurch. Wolves do not do this to each other. No predator I know of does this. Claire whispered, "Something's killing them." Jonah muttered a curse, his usual humor absent. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting something to emerge from the ravine walls. We didn't linger. We took our notes, snapped our photos, and climbed out of that place as fast as snowshoes would allow. But the image of that wolf followed me, burned into my mind. That night, I lay awake, listening. The howling never came. For the first time since arriving, the wilderness was silent, and somehow that was worse. The next morning, as we prepared to survey another ridge, Jonah found tracks near the cabin. Not wolf tracks, not elk. These were larger, deeper, and unlike anything I had cataloged. They were vaguely humanoid, 5-toed, elongated, but far too big, each stride covering impossible distances. They circled the cabin once before vanishing into the trees. We said little. Fear had crept in, though none of us wanted to admit it aloud. We were scientists, bound to data and evidence. Yet what evidence could we trust when the forest itself seemed to warp around us? That afternoon, Claire suggested we cut the expedition short. Jonah agreed readily. I hesitated, torn between duty and dread. But before we could finalize a plan, something happened that made the decision for us. Near dusk, as the sky bruised with storm clouds, we heard it. Not a howl, not the call of any known animal. It was a sound that began low, almost a growl, then rose into a keening wail that scraped the inside of the skull. It came from the ridge above the cabin, so loud and close it rattled the window panes. Claire dropped the telemetry receiver in shock. Jonah reached instinctively for the hunting rifle we kept for emergencies, his knuckles white. I stepped outside, against better judgment, my breath fogging in the bitter air. Snow drifted down in fine flakes. The trees stood black and still. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, thick, expectant. Then, from the ridge, a shape moved. Tall, upright. It lingered just long enough for me to see the outline against the fading light. Limbs too long, head crowned with something like antlers, though not like any antlers I knew. It shifted, tilting its head unnaturally, as though regarding me. Then it slipped back into the trees, gone as though it had never been. I stood there, frozen, my rational mind scrambling for footholds. Hallucination, optical illusion, but deep in my chest, something primal whispered the truth I refused to accept. We were not alone out here, and whatever shared these mountains with us was not bound by the rules of nature I had built my life around. Inside, Claire and Jonah stared at me, waiting for an explanation I could not give. That was the beginning. And it was only the first night we realized the wolves were not the only predators in those mountains. We didn't speak of leaving in the morning, though all three of us were thinking it. The decision hung between us like a cold draft we refused to acknowledge. Habit took over instead. We made coffee and pretended the day was ordinary. Claire rigged the telemetry gear and checked the receiver against the last recorded positions of the Iron Ridge pack. Jonah applied wax to snowshoe bindings and hummed tunelessly, a nervous habit he'd never had before. I blackened a page of my notebook with rational intentions returned to the ravine, document the wolf carcass, set camera traps, place acoustic monitors at perimeter points around the cabin, signal the regional office with an interim report before dusk. All of it sounded like science. It also felt like offering my mind a rope to hold, while the rest of me looked out over a cliff. We geared up and stepped into a daylight that felt bruised. Clouds stacked low over the ridges, and the world existed in 10,000 shades of iron. Even the pines seemed to inhale and not exhale. The first set of tracks greeted us 15 yards from the porch, the same 5 toed, elongated impressions we'd found circling the cabin in the night. I crouched and touched the rim of one print. The edges were crisp, cut into the crust as though made by something heavy and precise. The span from heel to toe was longer than my boot. The depth suggested a weight we couldn't reconcile with the ground's hardness. The stride length was wrong too. Not only long but inconsistent, as if the thing had adjusted its gait mid-step to cover more distance than its body should allow. There were no drag marks, no sign of a tail or belly. It had approached from the trees, circled once, and then veered toward the ravine as if it had read my list. Jonah said, attempting something like humor, "We're being audited." "Be what?" Claire asked. "Something that hates our paperwork," he said, and his laugh died partway out. We followed the prints until the terrain shifted toward broken stone and snow, scarred brush, where the tracks thinned and then vanished, not softened by wind but clipped cleanly, as if the animal, if animal is the word, had stepped off the snow itself. We marked waypoints on our GPS and continued to the ravine, descending in silence. Here, the air grew colder in a way not accounted for by elevation or shade. Every sound seemed smaller, as though the ravine drank it. The wolf carcass was gone. For a few seconds we stood like figures in a diorama, arranged around an absence and made ridiculous by it. The place where the body had been was stamped with a pattern in the snow that made my teeth ache. Spirals upon spirals, shallow depressions nested into one another, like the ribs of some subterranean thing surfacing and sinking in place. There were no drag marks, no blood, no fur left behind. A few stiff hairs had frozen into the spiral grooves, and when I pinched them up with forceps, they broke with a dry snap, as if they'd been brittle for years and not hours. "We'll logged it," Claire said quietly, as if arguing with a judge. "We have images. We have timestamps. Things vanish," Jonah said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Wolves don't move their own dead. Scavengers don't clean with surgical neatness. Snow conceals. It does not edit. We set camera traps between stone outcrops at knee height, then another pair ranging higher to catch anything tall that moved." Claire placed an acoustic recorder in the shadow of a juniper, its small red light a heartbeat under frost. She checked the receiver again, and I watched a line of numbers slip into disorder. The caller from our neighboring pack, an old female I knew by the ugly notch in her right ear, broadcast at a signal strength that jumped between a whisper and a shout. The elevation reading dipped below the ravine floor and then flicked up to where there was nothing but sky. "It's bouncing," Claire said. "I've never seen it bounce like this." "Reflection off the rock," I said, but the ravine walls were not smooth, and I knew telemetry ghosts when I heard them. This felt less like a reflection and more like something wrenching the signal around itself. We hiked out fast. Every crunch of my snowshoe felt too loud, too definitive, as if my steps were declarations I couldn't retract. Back at the cabin, we warmed our hands over the stove and reviewed what data we had, looking for any rational hinge. It's a habit I trust. You cross-check, you compare notes, you aim for alignment. What we got instead was an unease that rose like a tide under our table. The timeline did not misalign because of human error. We were meticulous. The environment was misbehaving. Near dusk, a light snow began to fall, and with it came a pressure in the sinuses that made us all rub our temples. The acoustic recorder began transmitting a low, steady hum we could hear even through the cabin's thin walls. It wasn't wind. It wasn't any ambient mechanical. The sound had a structure, a pulse that felt like a voice translated into a frequency the body understands before the mind does. It made me nauseated and embarrassed, as if the wilderness had spoken a joke about me to the trees. "Stop," Claire said at last. Her hands hovered above the receiver, like she wanted to push it away without touching it. "Kill the feed." I shut it off, and silence returned with the weight of a falling blanket. Outside, the snow thickened. We took turns going out to brush it from the solar panels and to ensure our lines and vents stayed clear. During my second pass, I saw lights along the tree line. At first, they seemed like drops of pale fire caught between trunks. Then they moved, and I realized they were not separate from the shapes that held them. Eyes. High. Too high for a wolf, arranged in a staggered line, as if several upright figures stood watching in perfect mutual stillness. I told myself that the eyes belong to elk, to Deeple. There are times a mind needs to survive. It reaches for the nearest shelf of explanations, even if they're the wrong shape. The eyes did not blink. They did not bob or turn. They aligned with the rhythm of that earlier hum, as if whatever we had switched off in our receiver continued out there in a form that required no battery. I went inside. I did not say what I'd seen. I wrote down that I had seen it and that I had chosen not to say, which felt like honesty's lesser twin. We slept in layers of clothing, boots lined up under the cots, headlamps within reach. At some point after midnight, something tapped the glass of the kitchen window. Not a knock, not claws. A tap that had intelligence in it, a patience that made my mouth dry. Another tap. Another. I lay too still, as if any movement would offer a target. Claire's cot creaked softly. Jonah didn't move. The tapping continued, slow but not random, a pattern like a question repeated until the answer it wanted arrived by force. It stopped only with the thin brightness of morning. That day, reason lost ground by inches. Wolf tracks crossed the meadow to the east of the cabin, then doubled back on themselves in a tight, not before striking off at a speed I could not reconcile with paw length and energy conservation. We found a grove of saplings bent into an arching ring, not by snow load but by deliberate, even pressure, the bark peeled in long corkscrews, each pale wound exposing cambium that had not yet browned. The sap smelled sharp and wrong, as if it had retained the metallic ghost of blood. We walked the ring, and any step taken inside it felt heavier than any taken outside. That was not a feeling I could document in a notebook, and I wrote it down anyway. Around noon, we found scat on the trail that contained bone chips from a species we'd not seen here. Jaw fragments from a snowshoe hare, yes, but also a small smooth knob I at first took for pebble and then realized was a human molar. I wanted to be wrong so badly that I nearly made myself wrong by force of wishing. The enamel shone under my glove. There was a thin brown hair curled around its root, short and too uniform to be from any of us. The hair was brittle like the wolf pelt, and when I stretched it, it broke, and a drift of dust let go of it and disappeared on the air. We stood and breathed like three people practicing how to do it. "What could call it in?" Jonah said. "We could, break protocol and just call it in." "To who?" Claire said. "And say what?" "That something out here is making jewelry out of bad ideas," he said, and he looked young in the places fear makes a person young. We weren't alone. That realization is not the same as believing in monsters. It is simply accepting data without the laziness of a prepackaged explanation. We were not alone, and whatever shared this place with us had a habit of folding the rights of the natural world into shapes that served some other appetite. In the mid-afternoon we caught sight of a cougar track and followed it for the comfort of its normality. It led us to another stag carcass, fresher, its body splayed wide as if something had pried it open to read. The heart was gone. There was no blood. The ribs were scraped clean in a spiral pattern that made me step back and keep stepping until a tree stopped me. Jonah swore without sound. Claire lifted her camera, then lowered it. Some things should not be preserved even if documentation is the point. I made notes I couldn't later read, my hand unfamiliar. On the hike back, a signal came through strong from the old female's collar again. So clear it felt like relief. The coordinates placed her near the western ridge, less than a mile from the cabin. There was a density to that signal that felt like the world apologizing. We moved quick and quiet through powder, the afternoon going blue around the edges, and we crested a low saddle that gave us a view of the slope below. A dark shape moved against the snow, then another. Wolves, 24 at least, gathered in a rough arrangement at the edge of the trees. The old female stood slightly apart, her posture still proud despite an obvious limp. My chest loosened. They were whole. They were behaving like wolves again. Then they lifted their heads as one and stared up toward the ridge line above us, not howling, not moving. Their bodies at attention the way deer stand when the world takes in one long breath to listen. A sound moved over us. It had no origin I could point to. It was like a breath pulled through bone flutes arranged in a spiral and dragged slowly through pitch. My knees wanted the snow. Claire took my wrist without looking at me and squeezed it until my fingers tingled. Below, the pack began to fold. I don't know how else to say it. Not collapse. Fold, like paper taught a trick. Their lines bent inward, and for a moment they were a shape that wasn't a pack or a cluster or anything wolves make. The old female took a step forward, bared her teeth, and then stepped back into her own shadow, and was suddenly 5 yards to the left where her shadow now fell. An afterimage stayed behind like a smudge. Jonah whispered, "We're leaving." We're leaving now. The wolves broke then all at once, scattering into the trees without a sound. The slope below us was empty in a way that made it feel like an answer to a question I was terrified to hear. We retraced our path as carefully as panic allowed. No one spoke until the cabin's walls were between us and the ridge, and even then, the walls felt like a courtesy granted, and not a guarantee. We did the practical things we could. We packed non-essentials. We gathered the camera traps, SD cards with clumsy hands and downloaded what we could. A few frames showed nothing but a distortion in the air, a bend where light had given up its fidelity. One showed a figure between two tree trunks tall, narrow, no detail, as if the camera had captured a shape cut from the idea of a figure and not from a body. We decided to leave at first light. The trail will be buried by then, I said, but I preferred the pretense of a trail to wading through what the night promised. The snow deepened. Wind pressed its face against the cabin and made a steady low complaint at the door seam. We ate in the perfunctory way field people eat, when they need calories but no taste. We took turns pretending to sleep. Near 2 in the morning, the radio crackled. Not a station, not the emergency band, our handheld, the one that should have been quiet unless one of us keyed it. A voice came through, skittering at the edge of the signal, like a trapped beetle. I stood and listened and looked at Jonah to confirm that I was hearing something real. He held very still. The voice said my name, or something like it. Then it said it again with the vowel in the wrong place, like someone trying a familiar word on backward. It said Claire's name, and it made her flinch. It said Jonah's name twice in a row with a rattle, between akin to the clatter of antlers. Only no deer I've known shakes its rack in a way that makes consonants. I took the radio and turned it off, and that felt like pushing a head underwater. I turned it on again because something in me wanted to see if the voice had lungs or only the patience of machines. Silence. Then a small, bright sound against the glass. The tap from the night before. Exactly the same spacing, exactly the same restraint. We're leaving now, Jonah said, without the tremor of before. He opened the gear locker and began packing the most necessary parts of our necessary lives. The snowmobiles were buttoned under tarps beside the woodpile. We kicked through drifts to reach them. Batteries in deep cold are cruel, but Jonah keeps his tools in compulsive order. He unwrapped cables with his gloves in his teeth and clamped a jump pack to the first machine's terminals. The engine turned weakly once, twice, then caught, the recoil of its noise ripping the quiet at the seams. I strapped the Pelican case with data drives and notebooks to the rear rack. Claire checked the second machine and swore softly. The starter rope's handle was missing. The rope snapped, a clean cut like wire had kissed it. Not where, not whether. Something that had preferred us not to leave had taken the simplest step. One machine would do if we made 2 runs. We had made worse choices in worse weather. We had not, however, made choices under observation by something that had learned the pace of our names. We send one person first, I said, and the way I said it made it sound like a plan. A run to the trailhead. Call in, send help. Bring back the truck. 2 hours, 3 at most. I'm the heaviest, Jonah said. I'll take the first run. I can muscle it if it gets finicky on the hills. I looked at his face and found no greed for heroism, only the look of a man who had decided he would rather move than be still. We loaded him light food, water, a shovel, the small survival kit we keep for when the plan breaks its leg. He shouldered the radio and checked his headlamp and kissed his hand to the cabin's doorframe, like a second baseman to a crucifix. I told him to stay out of the trees. He told me he wasn't planning to race slalom. We watched him cut a track across the meadow, skirt the grove with the bent saplings, and disappear into the white. His headlamp bobbed twice among trunks and then was gone. The sound of the engine faded to a rumor, and then to what I wanted to call distance. I stood a long time, counting to numbers that meant nothing, until Claire touched my arm and pulled me inside, and we waited. The radio was a clock then. It ticked without ticks. 15 minutes. 30. An hour. The snow against the windows made a sound like a man rubbing a thumb over paper. At an hour and 20, the radio crackled and Jonah's voice came on a gust of static. As with everything in those hours, relief became another thing quickly deformed into its opposite. "A lie," the voice said. Then, Elias. Then, in a different cadence entirely, Dr. Mercer. Jonah never called me that. "Jonah," I said. "Report." "Something wrong with the trail," he said, his breath high and fast. "I went around the grove and then I hit something I can't see. The trees are wrong. The rocks are wrong. I got turned, and then I was back at the grove, only I didn't turn. I went straight. I marked a tree and went straight again, and the mark was in front of me before I could be proud of it. I don't know where the road is. I don't know if there is a road. Stay put," I said. "We can snowshoe to you." "We can?" The radio filled with the same low hum we'd heard through the acoustic recorder, not overlaid on his voice but around it, like the air between his words had decided to body forth and speak. He said our names again, and then he said a third name I did not recognize, syllables like the clicking of bone beads in a fist. The headlamp we had sent with him appeared, then through the window, the light lying along the edge of the trees, as if set on the ground. It moved once to the left and then stayed still. The radio died into silence like a heart shrinking. We dressed without speaking. My hands knew how to handle straps and buckles, while the rest of me rehearsed the sequence of our own disappearance. We followed the shallow rut of the snowmobile track at first, our headlamps small and stupid in the open. The wind had not yet filled it. At the bent grove the world took a step sideways. That is the closest I have to language for it. The place smelled different. The cold felt crowded, as if something stood close enough to my face that my breath rebounded off its invisible skin. My next step placed my boot into a print that was not my own. 5 toes long, the heel too narrow, the gait too hungry. "Elias," Claire said evenly, and her calm was a rung on a ladder over water. "Look," she pointed to a stand of spruce. A shape moved at a height where eyes should not be. Too many joints rearranged themselves as a hand grasped a branch. Not fingers. Something like fingers but lengthened, knuckled in the wrong places. The branch, a dead one, rattled with a dry sound that echoed the antler, click I'd once loved in fall. The shape tilted ahead toward us, and an outline that could have been antlers was crowded with additional lines, like the interpretation of antlers by a child who wants to improve nature with more nature. Light from our lamps found nothing to attach itself to in that face. We backed away without pretending we weren't retreating. The headlamp on the ground ahead brightened and dimmed in a slow pulse, and I understood finally that it wasn't lying still. It was being covered by fresh snow from no discernible wind. It was being buried carefully, ritualistically, by something that preferred to put its toys away between games. We reached the headlamp and found it half submerged, still on, still warm, though the snow it had attracted to itself had not melted. Beyond it, Jonah's snowmobile sat tilted, its track chewed into a ring as if it had spun in place around a point that was not there. His boot prints led away 10 yards, and then lengthened into prints that were less and less his. The human shape of them diluted with each step until they were the wrong prints, the ones from the cabin, accompanied by something like a dragging line, a tail or a long, indecisive limb. The last of them vanished at the grove's inner edge, with the same clipped finality the ravine had taught us. There is a moment in any disaster where the brain revises the definition of reasonable. The new reasonableness wanted me to run screaming into the trees. The old reasonableness kept me upright, because the alternative felt like a rehearsal of prey. Claire took the headlamp and tucked it under her jacket like a warm stone against her ribs. "We'll go back," she said.
We'll go back now.
The return to the cabin felt longer though our tracks, and the wind's memory said otherwise. We shut the door and barred it with our shoulders, in a way a door is not meant to be barred. We turned off our headlamps and stood in the small rectangle of dimness that the lantern cast up into the rafters, each of us listening for our own heartbeat to prove it was not one of the taps at the window. It came then, not tapping. Footsteps that were not steps, a soft rearranging. As if the snow itself were practicing walking. The handle of the door moved not in a knock, but in the gentle melancholy of someone testing a thing they already know is lock. A shadow passed across the window like a taller night for a split second, and I saw in it something that should have been a reflection and was not. A hand rested there, palm to the glass. Too many joints articulated beneath skin that was not skin. For an instant, the palm copied the whorls of a fingerprint pattern, as if sketching an answer key. Then the fingers flexed with the impatience of a large animal that has learned how to imitate restraint. A voice spoke from the trees. Jonah's timbre. His cadence askew. He called my name. He called Claire's. He said, "Dacca Mercer," again with tenderness, as if the title were a kind of leash. He asked to be let in. I didn't answer. He asked again, smiling with words Jonah would not have chosen. He said he was cold in a way that made the word cold move through me like a thin needle. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, and her teeth clicked. I put my hand on the radio and told myself it was a different kind of hand holding. The voice came closer. The footsteps did not. That felt important to some survival geometry we did not invent. The door handle turned once more, slow and complete. A weight leaned into it, and the wood hummed like a small animal's throat. The lantern dimmed without losing flame. On the far wall, tiny threads of frost spread, wrote their story in a language of veins, and receded. "Jonah," I said at last, and hated hearing it leave me like an offering. The voice outside stilled, and a shiver went from my scalp to my ankles. "Say the name of the town where we met." Silence opened, and into it came a sound not answer and not refusal. It was the same spiral note we had heard sung by the ravine, by the pack, by whatever patience had learned us as well as our own mothers. The door eased, a caress without consent, and then the pressure left it. The footsteps moved away into the trees, and the voice went with them in the wrong direction, bending around the cabin as if it were a hill. We waited, not for a countable length of time, but until something inside that had been braced for impact chose to unclench in exhaustion. Claire sat at the table and wept with no drama, no heving, just water leaving her the way light leaves a room at dusk. I put my hand on her shoulder, and she didn't shrug it off, which felt like mercy. On the stove, the coffee from morning had become the idea of coffee, and then something else entirely. I drank it anyway and felt stupidly stronger. "What do we do when morning comes?" Claire asked. She looked at the window as if it were a new kind of clock. "We leave on foot," I said, saying it made it true enough to carry for another hour. Would take the high trail. We stay out of the trees as much as we can. We go fast, we go light, and we do not answer if our own names follow us. "And Jonah?" she asked, and the cruelty of the question's necessity did not spare either of us. "We do not stop for the shape of him," I said, and saying that made me part of a species I had never wanted to join. We packed again in a new order. The cabin's few comforts sorted into piles that meant nothing now. I tucked the SD cards into the inner pocket of my jacket, where body heat might keep them honest. Claire stowed the headlamp we had taken from the snow and folded a wool blanket around the acoustic recorder, as if hiding a child from bad weather. We sat then, two animals at the edge of their den, waiting for a light that might mean either daybreak or an invention of the thing that had learned our switches. When the sound came, it did not come from the window or the door or the roof. It came from beneath the floorboards, a slow drag like the weight of a tail, or a long undecided limb pulling itself between joists. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, and then back, as if testing purpose against foundation. I stood because my body thinks vertical makes you harder to steal. Claire stood because I did. The lantern's light shivered without wind. The sound stopped under the place where I had laid my notebook. I imagined pages erased, diagrams made obsolete by someone else's hand. A moment later, the tapping resumed at the window in the same careful rhythm as before, and the thing under the floor pulled itself toward the door. Patient, efficient, unwilling to choose only one path. We were going to have to open the door at dawn and step into what wanted us. That realization did not bring courage. It brought a steadiness that felt like a new kind of survival, not the absence of fear, but its exact measurement, filled to the rim and carried without spilling, step by step, into the day. Dawn should have meant safety. That's what we told ourselves through the dark hours, while something tapped at the glass and shifted under the floorboards. Morning is the covenant of wilderness work, no matter how cold the night, no matter what shapes the dark makes of trees. Sunrise brings the world back into reason. I had built a life on that rhythm. But when the gray light finally seeped into the cabin, it carried no reprieve. It felt thinner, like a counterfeit dawn printed on cheap paper. We packed with mechanical precision. I checked each buckle twice, loaded extra batteries for headlamps, stowed notebooks and SD cards in watertight pouches. Claire strapped the rifle across her back and carried the acoustic recorder as though it were a relic, its red light blinking weakly, an ember refusing to die. We left the stove cold, the coffee pot half full, the cots unmade. There was a finality to it, like abandoning a house not because you're moving, but because the ground under it has soared. The snow had deepened overnight, a powder so fine it creaked under our snowshoes. The air carried no wind, only the dense hush of a forest listening. We stepped into the meadow, following the faint trough of Jonah's snowmobile track, now softened by fresh fall. Claire walked slightly ahead, her eyes fixed on the tree line, jaw set in a way that warned me not to speak. I fell into rhythm behind her, our breaths the only proof of motion. For the first half-mile nothing happened. No prints besides ours, no unnatural shapes in the periphery. My chest began to loosen, almost believing the night had been a collective delirium. Then we reached the bent grove. The trees still leaned into their arch, bark peeled in spirals. Inside the ring, the snow looked untouched, pristine. But when I stepped closer, a pressure built in my ears, the same sensation of descent on an airplane, only deeper, as though the air inside the grove weighed more than the air outside. Claire stopped me with a hand on my arm. "Don't," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "Not inside." I nodded, relieved that she felt it too, that I wasn't alone in the distortion. We skirted the grove wide, breaking a new trail through knee-deep powder. Beyond it, the terrain sloped toward a frozen creek, the surface spidered with cracks under snow's thin veil. We followed its edge, careful, scanning for Jonah's boot prints. We didn't find boots. We found paws. Wolf tracks emerged from the tree line and followed the creek parallel to us. At first I thought they belonged to the Iron Ridge pack, but they were too large, too deep. The stride was wrong, Too long, too heavy, and there was only one set. Wolves are not solitary in winter. A single trail meant either a disperser or something imitating a wolf poorly. We followed because not following felt worse. The tracks led us into a hollow where the creek narrowed between boulders. Here the snow was churned violently, as if animals had circled in panic. Tufts of fur lay frozen into the drifts, gray and coarse. Claire knelt and touched one, then recoiled. The fur dissolved under her glove, crumbling into ash that left a black smear on the snow. I wanted to say something, anything rational, but the air around us grew heavy with silence, pressing words flat. Then came the sound. At first it was a low hum, familiar from the acoustic recorder, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. Then it fractured into voices, layered, overlapping, too many to count. Some I recognized: Jonah's timbre, strained and uneven; Claire's, though she stood beside me silent; even my own, repeating phrases I had spoken days earlier. 12 individuals identified. 200 square miles collar up to 3 wolves. The words twisted, looped back, lost grammar. The forest was speaking our data back to us in a chorus of mockery. Claire clamped her hands over her ears. "Make it stop," she hissed. "God, make it stop." I gripped her shoulder, grounding both of us, though my own skull felt ready to split. The voices swelled, then cut off abruptly, leaving the hollow too quiet. The only sound left was the brittle creak of snow settling under its own weight. That was when we saw him. At the far end of the hollow, half concealed behind a boulder, a figure stood. At first my heart leaped. It was Jonah. His parka, his snow pants, his hood pushed back to reveal his face. Relief surged so sharp it hurt. "Jonah," I shouted, stepping forward. He didn't move, his eyes fixed on us, wide, unblinking. Then, slowly, he smiled, not Jonah's smile. Too wide, too stiff, as though the muscles had been arranged by someone unfamiliar with their use. His arms hung too long at his sides, fingers grazing the snow. Claire raised the rifle. "That's not him," she whispered. I froze mid-step. The figure tilted its head, the way the antlered shape had done on the ridge. The smile remained a grotesque mask. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped backward into the shadow of the boulder. Not around it, not behind it. Into it, as though the rock had opened to receive him. He was gone. My stomach turned to ice. Claire lowered the rifle, trembling. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We knew now Jonah was not coming back. Or if he did, it would not be Jonah. We climbed out of the hollow fast, lungs burning. Each ridge we crested felt like escape, each descent like a trap. By midday the sky had darkened with approaching storm. Snow began to fall in thick flakes, erasing our tracks almost as quickly as we made them. We stopped briefly to eat energy bars, chewing in silence, our jaws clumsy with exhaustion. That was when we heard the howl. It rose from the ridge above us, long and mournful, unmistakably wolf. But it carried something else within it, a resonance that made the hair rise on my neck. Wolves howl in chorus, voices weaving together. This was one voice, layered upon itself, harmonizing in impossible ways. It was both near and far, both singular and plural. It sounded like grief stretched across a shape too large to hold it. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "It's wrong," she whispered. "It's so wrong." We pushed on, but the howl followed, echoing through valleys ahead of us, behind us, always just beyond sight. At times it seemed to circle us, herding us like prey. My rational mind screamed for explanation, acoustic anomalies, temperature inversions. But deep inside I knew we were being guided. By late afternoon we reached a plateau where the forest opened into a wide clearing. Snow lay unbroken, pristine. In the center stood a single standing stone. Taller than a man, its surface carved with spirals identical to those we'd found in the ravine. The sight of it stole my breath. I had studied enough indigenous sites to know sacred markers when I saw them, but this was older, rawer, stripped of cultural context. It felt like geometry itself had grown teeth. Claire approached cautiously, circling the stone. Her gloved hand hovered inches from its surface, as though repelled by an unseen force. "Elias," she said softly. "The wolves." I followed her gaze. All around the clearing, at the edge of the tree line, wolves stood, dozens of them. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, not with reflection but with their own inner fire. They did not move, did not breathe. They simply watched, forming a perfect ring around us. My pulse thundered. Instinct screamed to raise my arms, to make myself large, to shout. But something deeper warned against it. These were not wolves in the way I knew wolves. They were vessels, statues filled with attention. Claire whispered, "What do we do?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as ash. "We don't run." The wolves held their vigil. Snow fell between us. Soft, steady. Then, as one, they lifted their heads and howled. The sound hit like a physical force, rattling my ribs, vibrating the stone. The spirals carved into its surface began to glow faintly, lines of pale light crawling like veins. The howling grew louder, layers folding over each other, until it was no longer sound but a pressure filling every hollow in my body. I fell to my knees, hands clamped over my ears. Beside me, Claire screamed, though I could barely hear it. The stone pulsed brighter, spirals rotating slowly, impossibly, as though the rock itself were turning inside out. And then I saw it. In the space between the spirals, something moved. Not behind the stone, not within it. Between its geometry, a shape struggling to resolve, limbs lengthening, contracting, splitting, antlers that weren't antlers, a face that wore faces like masks shuffled in a deck. Eyes too many, too wide, all fixed on me. The howling stopped. The clearing fell silent. The wolves lowered their heads in unison, bowing. The thing stepped forward. Its feet touched snow without sinking. Its body bent wrong, as though joints were added or removed at will. When it breathed, the air crystallized into spirals that drifted down like ash. It regarded us with that tilt of the head I had seen before, the gesture now unmistakably its own. Claire raised the rifle, hands shaking. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The thing smiled. Jonah's smile, my smile, her smile. Then it spoke, and the sound was all voices at once, including ours. "Stay back," it said. "Stay back." The words echoed around the clearing, bouncing from wolf to wolf, until it sounded as though the forest itself was warning us away. Claire fired. The crack split the air, deafening. The bullet struck the thing square in the chest and passed through, hitting the stone beyond with a dull thud. The spirals flared bright, then dimmed. The creature didn't flinch. It only laughed, a sound like dry leaves caught in a whirlpool. The wolves broke their bow, scattering into the trees. Snow swirled up as they fled, blotting the clearing into chaos. The thing stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the snow toward us. Claire grabbed my arm. "Run." We did. We plunged into the forest, branches whipping our faces, snow dragging at our legs. Behind us, the laughter followed, sometimes far, sometimes impossibly close. The forest twisted, paths folding back on themselves, landmarks repeating. Every tree looked the same, every ridge a copy of the last. My compass spun uselessly. The GPS read coordinates that changed with every glance, leaping hundreds of miles, then zeroing in on our position with predatory accuracy. By the time darkness fell, we were lost, utterly, hopelessly lost. We collapsed under an outcrop, shivering lungs burning. Claire pressed her face into her knees, whispering prayers or curses, I couldn't tell which. I stared into the night, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere out there, it waited. Not hunting us the way wolves hunt prey, but shepherding us, guiding us towards something we had no choice but to meet. And I knew, With a certainty colder than the snow beneath me, this was no longer research. This was initiation. We did not sleep. The outcrop gave us a roof of stone and little else, a shallow reprieve from the storm that thickened the night into blindness. Claire and I sat pressed together for warmth, every joint aching with exhaustion, but fear is its own stimulant. I kept the rifle balanced across my knees, though in my heart I knew it was theater. We had fired already. Bullets had meant nothing. The forest moved around us. Not the wind, not animals. Movement like breath, like the woods themselves were practicing lungs. The trees shifted subtly, bending in directions that didn't match the storm. The snow fell in spirals, always spirals, as if the sky had been taught a new shape and couldn't stop repeating it. I tried the radio once more, a fool's hope. Static hissed, then resolved into my own voice from days ago. The Iron Ridge Wolves. 12 individuals identified. My voice, flat, clinical, pulled from the archive of my memory. Then Jonah's voice, whispering my name with the wrong inflection. Then Claire's voice, crying, "Make it stop." I snapped it off, throat tight. Claire watched me, eyes hollow, her lips blue with cold. "It doesn't want us to call for help," she said. "No," I whispered. "It wants us to listen." The storm thinned toward dawn, but the light it revealed was wrong. The snow was deeper than it should have been, burying our tracks from minutes earlier. Trees leaned at odd angles, paths doubled back. Landmarks repeated. I knew this forest well enough to navigate it blindfolded in summer. Now it was a labyrinth written by something with no interest in letting us leave. We stumbled through drifts, directionless. Hunger gnawed at us, thirst clawed our throats. Hours blurred. Once we found a line of wolf tracks crossing our path, but they circled in on themselves, forming a spiral that led nowhere. Another time we came upon Jonah's snowmobile, half buried, though we had left it miles behind. Snow had filled its track, but the machine itself was untouched, pristine, as if set there for us to find. Claire kicked it until her foot bled, sobbing. "We're never getting out," she said. I wanted to argue, to anchor her with rationality. But the words wouldn't come, because she was right. By dusk we reached another clearing. The standing stone waited there, spirals carved deep, glowing faintly with inner light. My knees nearly gave out. This was not the same clearing as before. It couldn't be, and yet it was. The wolves stood around it again, silent, eyes burning. Their fur stirred in wind that wasn't there. When they breathed, frost spilled from their mouths in perfect unison. They parted as we entered, as if granting us passage. At the stone's base lay Jonah, or what wore Jonah's skin. He lay curled like a child, his parka open, chest bare to the cold. His skin was stretched too tight, ribs showing through, limbs too long, as though pulled on a rack. His eyes opened as we approached. They glowed faintly, like the wolves. He smiled with cracked lips. "Elias," he said. His voice was wrong, every syllable fractured, spoken twice, as though echoed by a mouth inside his mouth. "You made it." Claire raised the rifle, sobbing. I put a hand on it, pushing it down. The futility was too obvious now. Jonah, or the thing that had replaced him, stood slowly, joints popping. He looked at us, then at the stone. "They chose me first," he said. His voice carried the weight of many voices, overlapping, dissonant. "They'll choose you too." The spirals on the stone flared, rotating slowly, impossibly. Light bled from them, casting long shadows that bent away from their owners. Between the spirals, movement stirred the same shifting form, limbs lengthening and breaking, antlers sprouting and retracting, faces overlapping like masks shuffled too quickly to see. Claire screamed, firing. The shot cracked, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed, cut off. Jonah laughed, or rather, the thing in him laughed, a sound of dry leaves and splintering bone. The wolves began to howl. The sound was no longer mournful. It was celebratory, triumphant. The thing stepped out of the stone. It was taller now, clearer, as though the forest itself had lent its substance. Its skin, or what passed for skin, shifted like shadow across water. Its face settled on Jonah's for a moment, then Claire's, then mine, then dozens I didn't recognize. Each one smiled. Each one spoke. "Elias," it said in my own voice. "Stay with us." Claire fired again, screaming. The bullet passed through. The wolves didn't flinch. The thing extended a hand, too many jointed, palm outward. The spirals in the air bent toward it, snow swirling into its grasp. I felt a pull in my chest, like my very breath was being wound into its spiral. Claire dropped the rifle, clutching her throat, gasping. I staggered forward, rage and terror burning through exhaustion. "What do you want?" I shouted. It tilted its head, antlers rattling like bone chimes. "To make you part of the circle?" it said. The wolves howled louder. The stone glowed brighter. Jonah laughed until his jaw cracked open wider than it should have, teeth splitting into too many rows. Claire collapsed to her knees, choking. Her breath crystallized in front of her, pulled from her lungs. I grabbed her, shaking, shouting her name. Her eyes rolled back, and for a moment I saw spirals reflected in them, glowing faintly. "No!" I roared, pulling her away, though away meant nothing anymore. The clearing bent, folding every direction the same. The thing loomed closer, its shadow covering us. It leaned down, and in its face I saw my own again, smiling with perfect, terrible calm. "You've always been ours," it whispered. The wolves closed in. The howl reached a pitch beyond hearing, beyond pain. The spirals flared blindingly, and then, darkness. I woke in a hospital bed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. An IV trailed from my arm. My chest ached with every breath. Outside the window, mountains loomed under a pale winter sky. A nurse noticed me stirring. Relief flooded her face. "Dacca Mercer," she said. "You're awake. They found you near the trailhead. You were half frozen. You're lucky to be alive." I tried to speak. My throat was raw. "Claire, Jonah." Her face fell. "You were alone." Alone. I closed my eyes, memory tearing at me. The wolves, the stone, the spirals. Claire collapsing. Jonah's body bending wrong, the thing wearing all our faces. Had it been real? A hallucination born of hypothermia, exhaustion, stress. But when I opened my eyes again, I saw the window. Frost spread across the glass in delicate patterns. Spirals. Perfect spirals. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, a howl rose. Not human. Something in between. Something waiting.